In the waning days of the Fourth Age, when the kingdoms of men had grown mighty, and the memory of the War of the Ring had passed into legend, a shadow stirred once more in the desolate lands of Mordor. The Black Gate, Morannon, stood as it ever had, a monument to darkness now silent and broken. Yet beneath its crumbling stones, something ancient began to pulse with malevolent life. Aldenor, son of Beregond of Minas Tirith, rode the borders of Ithilien with his company of rangers. The autumn mist clung to the Ephel Duath like a shroud, and the air carried an unnatural chill that made even the hardiest men pull their cloaks tight. 3 days had passed since the strange red light had been seen emanating from the ruins of Barad-dûr, and King Elessar had dispatched his most trusted scouts to investigate. "Captain," whispered Galeon, a young ranger whose keen eyes had served them well in many perilous journeys, "the very stone weep blood. Indeed, from the black rocks of Mordor's border, a crimson substance seeped like tears of the earth itself. Where it touched the ground, no grass would grow, and the few hardy plants that had begun to reclaim the wasteland withered and died. The horses grew restless, their eyes rolling white with an ancient terror. Aldenor dismounted and approached the seeping stone, his hand resting upon the hilt of his father's sword. The blade had been reforged from steel, taken from the very gates of Barad-dûr after Sauron's fall, and now it trembled with an energy that seemed to answer the darkness before them. "By the Valar," he breathed, for upon the stone were carved runes in the Black speech. Yet these were not the crude markings of orc, but something far older and more terrible. The characters seemed to shift and writhe before his eyes, and as he watched, they began to glow with that same crimson light. Far to the north, in the halls of Erebor, Dain III felt the mountain shake beneath his feet. The dwarves had grown complacent in their prosperity, their axes more often used for crafting than war. But the Arkenstone, that great jewel that was the heart of the mountain, suddenly blazed with warning fire, and all who looked upon it were filled with dread. In Lothlorien, though much diminished since the departure of Lady Galadriel, the remaining elves felt the shadow pass over their hearts like a cold wind. The Malorn trees shed their golden leaves out of season, and Celeborn, last of the Noldor lords in Middle-earth, knew that the long peace was ended. The blood that wept from Mordor's stones was no mere seepage of the earth. It was the life force of the land itself, drawn forth by a power that should have been impossible in this age of the world. For in the depths beneath the Morannon, something that had lain sleeping since before the forging of the Rings of Power had awakened at last. The great horn of Minas Tirith sounded across the Pelennor fields, its deep voice carrying news of dire import to all who dwelt within the realm of Gondor. In the citadel of the kings, Elessar sat upon the throne of his fathers, his face grave with the weight of years and wisdom. Before him stood the rangers who had returned from their perilous journey to Mordor, their eyes haunted by what they had witnessed. "Speak, Aldenor," commanded the king, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked with wizards and spoken with the dead. "Tell me what evil stirs in the wasteland." Aldenor knelt before the throne, his weathered hands trembling as he drew forth a fragment of the bleeding stone. Even here, in the heart of the White City, the crimson substance continued to weep, and where its drops fell upon the marble floor, they hissed and steamed. "My lord," Aldanor began, his voice scarce above a whisper, "we have seen the very blood of the earth drawn forth by some dark sorcery. The stones speak in the Black speech, yet the words are of an older tongue, older even than the dominion of the Dark Lord. They speak of awakening, of the return of one whose name was forbidden to be spoken, even in the days of Gil-galad." A murmur of fear rippled through the assembled lords and captains. Imrahil of Dol Amroth, his beard now white with age, stepped forward. "What name, Captain? What power could achieve such horror?" But before Aldenor could answer, a cold wind swept through the great hall, though all the windows were sealed against the autumn chill. The torches flickered and dimmed, and in their dancing shadows, all present seemed to see the outline of a great eye, not red as Sauron's had been, but black as the void between the stars. From the north came urgent tidings. Ravens bore messages from Erebor, telling of the mountains trembling and of strange dreams that plagued Dian's sleep. Dreams of fire and darkness rising from beneath the earth. The Beornings sent word that the great bears were fleeing south, driven by some terror in the night. Even from distant Rohan came reports of horses that would not cross certain streams, as if the very water had become poisonous to their spirits. But it was the message from Rivendell that struck the deepest chord of fear in Aragorn's heart. Elrond Half-Elven, who had chosen to remain when his daughter sailed west, wrote in his flowing script, "The stars are going out, one by one, in the northern sky. The very foundations of Arda tremble. What was bound beneath the roots of the world stirs once more. The time of the Kindler of Stars may be at hand." The Kindler of Stars, a name from the elder days, whispered only in the most ancient lore. Not even Gandalf had spoken of such things, for they belonged to the time before the sun and moon, when the world was young and the valor walked openly in the circles of the world. Aragorn rose from his throne, his hand instinctively moving to Andúril's hilt. The blade of kings sang softly in its sheath, sensing the approach of great deeds and greater peril. "Send out the red arrow," he commanded. "Let it go to every ally of Gondor, from the Shire to the Sea of Rhûn. The darkness rises, and all who would stand against it must gather ere the moon wane, for I fear that this evil is beyond the strength of any one kingdom to withstand." In the great courtyard of Minas Tirith, beneath the white tree that bloomed eternal, representatives of all the free peoples gathered, as they had not done since the days of the last alliance. The air was thick with tension, for each had brought tidings of woe from their own land. From the Shire came Peregrine Took, no longer the impetuous hobbit of old, but now the Thane, his face lined with care. "My lords," he said in his clear voice, "the old forest stirs with malice once more. The Withywindle runs red as blood, and Tom Bombadil, he who knows all the songs of earth and water, has spoken no word for 7 days and nights." A gasp arose from the assembly, for if the master of wood, water, and hill was silent, then indeed the very foundations of the world were shaken. Legolas, prince of the woodland realm, and now lord of the Ithilien colony, spoke next. His fair face was troubled, and his usual joy in living things was replaced by grim concern. "The trees whisper of a name that should not be spoken. Even the malern leaves curl and blacken when the wind bears certain words from the east. My people grow sick at heart, and many speak of taking ship to the Grey Haven." Gimli, lord of Aglarond and master of the glittering caves, struck his axe upon the stone. "And what of the deep places? The very roots of the mountains crack and groan. My miners dare not delve deeper than 100 feet, for they hear singing in the depths, not the good songs of stone and jewel, but lamentations in a tongue that predates the awakening of the dwarves." But it was Celeborn who spoke the words that chilled every heart present. The Lord of Lothlorien stood tall and fair despite his great age, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages beyond the reckoning of mortal men. "I have walked in Middle-earth since before the rising of the sun," he said solemnly. "I was present when the Silmarils were crafted, and I stood with Gil-galad at the Battle of Dagorlad. But never have I felt such dread as now assails my spirit. The name that the stones speak in Mordor, the power that draws forth the blood of the earth. It is Melkor returned, but not as he was. Something greater and more terrible stirs, and I fear it is she who was his queen in the darkness before the dawn of the world." A silence fell upon the assembly, like the hush before a great storm, for the wise among them knew the tales of the elder days, when Morgoth had not ruled alone in the Iron Mountains of the north. Before his rebellion, before the theft of the Silmarils, there had been another, one whose beauty had been as great as her malice, whose power over the deep places of the earth had rivaled even the might of Aule the Smith. "Ungoliant," whispered Gandalf, for the White Wizard had returned from the Undying Lands, drawn by the great peril that now threatened all creation. But no, that darkness was devoured by her own hunger. This is older still, more cunning. This is she who was called the Queen of the Deeps. She who taught Sauron the making of the ring in ages past. King Elessar stood, and all eyes turned to him. The weight of kingship sat heavy upon his shoulders, for he knew that the choices made in this hour would determine the fate of all who drew breath beneath the sky. Then we must needs look to our strength, he declared. If such power rises in the east, we cannot meet it with sword and spear alone. We must seek wisdom in the deep places, strength in the high hall, and hope in the most unlikely corners of the world. Beneath the misty mountain, in tunnels that had not seen light since the elder days, Gimli led a company of the hardiest dwarves ever to swing pick or axe. With them went Legolas, for the friendship forged in the fires of the War of the Ring had only grown stronger with the passing years, and where one went, the other would follow. Their torches cast dancing shadows on walls carved with runes so ancient that even Gimli, learned in the lore of his people, could not read them. The air grew thick and oppressive as they descended, and strange echoes answered their footsteps, not the clean ring of boot on stone, but something that sounded almost like whispered words in an unknown tongue. "Master Elf," Gimli muttered, adjusting his grip on his axe. "I begin to think this was not the wisest course. These depths were sealed for good reason in the days of Durin the Deathless." Legolas nodded, his keen ears straining to catch sounds that lay beyond mortal hearing. Yet, if the answer to this new evil lies anywhere, it is here, in the roots of the mountains, where the world's first fires burned. Listen, do you hear that? From far below came a sound like the beating of a great heart, slow and rhythmic, as if some vast engine of creation or destruction pulsed in the deepest foundations of Arda. With each beat, the crimson substance that now wept from stones throughout Middle-earth seemed to pulse in sympathy, as if all were connected by veins of malice that ran through the very bedrock of the world. They pressed on, following passages that spiraled ever downward, past chambers filled with the bones of creatures that had never known the light of sun or stars. Here were the remnants of the first wars between good and evil, fought in darkness before the making of the two trees. At length, they came to a vast cavern, so wide that their torchlight could not reach its furthest walls. In the center stood a structure that froze the blood in their veins, an altar of black stone, older than the mountains themselves, carved with images that seemed to move in the flickering light. Upon it lay chains of mithril and gold, wrought with such skill that even Gimli gasped in admiration despite his fear. But the chains were broken. "By my beard," Gimli whispered, his voice echoing in the vastness. Something was bound here, something of great power, for these chains could have held a Balrog. Legolas approached the altar with the silent grace of his people, his bow strung and an arrow nocked. The images carved into the stone seemed to tell a story, the binding of a great power in the deeps, the sealing of passages, the setting of watchers that had long since crumbled to dust. "Not a Balrog," he said softly, his voice filled with growing dread. "Something far worse. Look here. This image shows the forging of the chains. See how many work at the task? Elves of Lindon, dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and," his voice faltered, "eagles of the misty mountains, all laboring together." Such cooperation was rare even in the elder days. They searched the chamber thoroughly, but found only dust and emptiness. Whatever had been bound here was free now, and from the freshly broken links of mithril, it had not been long released. As they prepared to depart, bearing news that would bring no comfort to those above, a sound echoed from the deepest tunnels, laughter, rich and melodious as silver bells, but filled with malice that made their very souls recoil in horror. "She knows we have found her prison," Legolas said grimly, "and she is not displeased. I think she wanted us to find this place, to know that her bonds are broken and her power waxes strong." The laughter came again, closer now, and with it came a whisper that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their hearts. Tell the little king that his crown will make a pretty bauble for my collection. Tell him that the age of men ends with fire and darkness, as it began. In the halls of Erebor, King Dayan III summoned the greatest smiths of his people to work as they had not worked since the forging of arms for the Battle of Five Armies. The mountain rang with hammer song, but these were not the joyful rhythms of creation. These were the desperate cadences of a people preparing for war against an enemy they scarcely understood. The Arkenstone, that great jewel which was the heart of the mountain, blazed with ever-increasing light, as if it sought to drive back shadows that pressed in from all sides. Its radiance revealed disturbing changes in the deep tunnels of Erebor. Walls that had stood unchanged for centuries now wept the same crimson substance that plagued all the lands of Middle-earth. Balin's cousin Ori, now ancient beyond the years of most dwarves, labored over the books of Mazarbul, seeking in the oldest records any mention of the evil that now stirred. His gnarled fingers traced lines of runes that spoke of the earliest days of his people, when they first delved into the roots of the mountain. "Here!" he called to his king, his voice cracked with age and urgency. "Here is a passage I had thought mere legend. It speaks of the Queen of the Deeps, she who was bound beneath the roots of Erebor itself, before the dwarves first made their halls. The binding was the work of all the free peoples, and it was sealed with blood of king and the light of the Silmarils themselves." Dayan read the ancient words, his face growing pale beneath his braided beard. "It says here that should she ever break free, the first sign would be the weeping of the stone, as the earth itself mourns what is to come. The second sign would be the kindling of the flame imperishable in the deepest places, a light that burns not with hope, but with the fury of creation perverted to destruction." As if summoned by his words, a runner burst into the chamber, his face blackened with soot, and his eyes wide with terror. "My lord, deep in the lower deeps, past the old workings of Balin's folk, there burns a flame such as no dwarf has ever seen. It gives no warmth, yet it melts stone as if it were wax. The miners flee before it, for it speaks with voices that promise madness to all who listen." King Dain took up his great hammer, forged from metal fallen from the sky in the elder days. "Then the time of preparation is ended. Send word to all our kinfolk, to the Iron Hills, to the Blue Mountain, to every hold and hall where dwarves still dwell. Let them come with all speed, for the last battle of our people may soon be upon us." Meanwhile, in the southern reaches of Gondor, strange ships had been sighted off the coast of Dol Amroth. These were not the black ships of Umbar, nor any vessels known to the harbor masters. They were wrought of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light, and their sails were woven from what appeared to be strands of night itself. Prince Imrahil, now old but still keen of eye, watched from the highest tower of his castle as the strange fleet drew near. No banners flew from their masts, but carved upon each prow was a symbol that made the old prince's blood run cold. A great spider with eyes like burning coal, the ancient sign of she who was called Ungoliant's Bane, the Queen of the Deep. "Ready the swan ships," he commanded his captain. "Send word to Minas Tirith that the enemy comes not only from the east, but from the uttermost south as well. And pray to the valor that our king's wisdom proves equal to the malice that now assails us from all quarters." But even as the defenses of Dol Amroth were prepared, watchers on the walls reported a sight that chilled their hearts. The dark ships were not crewed by living beings, but by shapes of shadow that moved with purpose, yet cast no reflection in the troubled waters of the bay. In a place that was neither in Middle-earth nor beyond it, where the boundaries of the physical world grew thin and the will could shape reality, the Queen of the Deeps held court with her servant. The chamber was vast beyond measurement, its walls formed from crystallized darkness that reflected not light, but the deepest fears of all who looked upon them. Before her throne, wrought from the bones of stars that had been devoured in the making of the world, knelt figures that had once been mighty in the circles of Arda. Here was the wraith of a Númenórean king who had sought immortality and found only endless servitude. Here knelt the shade of a dwarf lord who had delved too deep and awakened things better left sleeping. And here, most terrible of all, stood the corrupted form of one who had once been counted among the wise. "My queen," spoke the fallen Istari, his robes now black as midnight, and his staff crowned with crystal that pulsed with malevolent light. "The preparations are complete. The blood of the earth flows as you commanded, and your ancient enemies gather their puny strength, as ants might cluster before the boot that will crush them. She who sat upon the throne was beautiful beyond the dreams of mortal men, yet her beauty was as the beauty of a blade, perfect, terrible, and created only to bring death. Her voice, when she spoke, was like silver bells heard across a battlefield strewn with the dead. Tell me of their movements, my faithful servant. How do the children of Iluvatar prepare for the doom that rushes toward them?" The corrupted wizard bowed lower, his corrupted wisdom laid bare before her terrible majesty. "The dwarf king gathers his people in the mountain, thinking stone and steel will avail against your power. The elf lords debate in their fair hall, seeking wisdom in ancient lore that speaks only of your binding, not your release. And the mortal king, he sends his little warriors scurrying like mice, believing that courage and honor might yet preserve his realm." Laughter, like breaking glass, filled the impossible space. "They remember only the binding, never the reason for it. They have forgotten that I was not defeated, but merely contained, waiting for the wheel of time to turn and bring me my hour of triumph. Sauron was but my student, Morgoth merely my husband's shadow. I am the true inheritor of the power that shaped the music of creation itself." She rose from her throne, and as she did, the very foundations of reality trembled. Her form shifted and flowed like liquid darkness, sometimes appearing as the beautiful queen she had been in the first days of the world, sometimes revealing glimpses of the cosmic horror she had become through ages of corruption and malice. "But there is one thing that troubles me," she continued, her voice taking on an edge that could cut through steel. "The halfling king in his green lands, he sleeps peacefully while all around him the world prepares for war. Either he is a fool beyond measure, or he knows something that my sight cannot penetrate. Send the mouth of Sauron to me. His old master's knowledge may prove useful in understanding this riddle." From the shadows stepped a figure that made even the corrupted servants recoil in fear. The mouth of Sauron had not died with his master's defeat, but had instead fled to the deepest pits of Moria, where he had fed upon hatred and malice until he had become something worse than any orc or troll. His helmet still bore the fell marks of his office, but his eyes burned now with fires that belonged to his new mistress. "My queen commands, and I obey," he hissed through lips that had forgotten how to form words of kindness or mercy. "But I warn thee, the Shire folk have ever been more than they seemed. Their very insignificance was their shield in the days when Sauron ruled, and it may be so again." The Queen of the Deeps considered this, her perfect features marred by a frown that would have driven mortals to madness merely to witness. "Then perhaps it is time to test their resolve. Send forth the Nazgul, who still serve me. Yes, even in their diminished state, they retain power enough to trouble the peace of that green land. Let us see how the Thane of the Shire fares when his borders are troubled by more than wolves and wild weather." In the party field at Hobbiton, where once long ago Bilbo Baggins had celebrated his 11th birthday, Peregrine Took stood before the assembled hobbits of the Shire. His face bore the weight of his years as Thane, but his voice remained clear and strong as he addressed his people. "My dear friends," he began, his words carrying to every corner of the field. "Dark tidings have come from the world beyond our border. The very stones weep blood in the eastern land, and powers that should remain sleeping have awakened in the deep places of the earth." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. The hobbits of the Shire had known peace for many years since the Scouring, broken only by harsh winters or poor harvests. The thought of war and darkness returning was almost beyond their comprehension. Sam Gamgee, now mayor of Michel Delving and keeper of the Red Book, stood beside his old friend. His hair was white as snow, but his hands remained strong from years of gardening, and his eyes still held the steady courage that had carried him to the very fires of Mount Doom. "Begging your pardon, Thane," Sam said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But what would you have us do? We're not warriors like the big folk, nor wise in the ways of magic like the elves. We're just hobbits." Pippin smiled, but there was no mirth in it, only the grim resolve of one who had faced the darkness before and knew he might do so again. "Just hobbits, Sam? Have you forgotten so soon? It was just hobbits who carried the ring to its destruction. It was just hobbits who roused the Ents to war. And it was just hobbits who scoured our own land clean when it was defiled by evil." Before Sam could reply, a cold wind swept across the party field, carrying with it the scent of decay and old grave. The sky darkened as if a great cloud had passed before the sun, yet no cloud was visible in the clear autumn air. From the Barrow Downs came a sound that made every hobbit's blood run cold, the wailing of the dead, not at rest as they had been for so many years, but stirring once more to dark purpose. "The Barrow Wights," whispered Farmer Cotton, his weathered face pale with fear. "They walk again, as they did in the dark days of old, but worse was yet to come." From the old forest came the sound of splintering wood, as ancient trees, twisted by malice, uprooted themselves and began to march toward the borders of the Shire. The Withywindle, that river which Tom Bombadil had once commanded, ran red as blood and sang songs of hatred in a voice like grinding stone. And riding before this host of terror came shapes that the older hobbits recognized with dread. The Nazgul, the 9 riders of old. Though diminished by the fall of their master, they retained enough of their terrible power to freeze the hearts of mortal folk and turn bravery to despair. "To the Green Dragon!" cried Pippin, drawing the small sword that had been a gift from King Elisar long ago. "Every hobbit who can hold a blade or draw a bow, we make our stand at Bywater, as our fathers did before us." But even as the hobbits ran to gather their meager weapons, they heard a sound that gave them hope. From Bag End came the clear note of a horn, not the great horn of Gondor, but something older and more precious still. It was the horn of Thorin Oakenshield, given to Bilbo long ago, and passed down through the years to Frodo's heir. The sound of that horn carried across the Shire, and wherever it was heard, courage kindled in hobbit hearts. For though they were small and unwarlike, they were not without their own kind of strength. They had faced the darkness before, and they would face it again. In his study at Bag End, young Frodo Gardner, great-nephew to the ring-bearer and inheritor of his name, set aside the book he had been reading and took down Sting from its place above the mantle. The blade gleamed with its own light, as it had in the tunnels of Moria and the passes of Cirith Ungol, sensing the approach of foul thing. "Well then," he said to himself, his voice steady despite his youth, "it seems the stories aren't done with us yet." In the hidden valley of Rivendell, where the waters of the Bruinen sang their eternal song and the golden leaves of Malorn trees danced in the gentle breeze, Elrond Half-Elven stood upon the bridge before his house and watched the stars grow dim. One by one, the ancient lights were being devoured by a darkness that spread like a cancer across the night sky. Beside him stood his sons, Elladan and Elrohir, returned from their long wandering in the wild lands. Their faces bore the grim set of warriors who had seen too much of evil, yet their eyes held still the light of the firstborn, undimmed by years of sorrow. "Father," said Elladan, his voice heavy with foreboding, "the very foundations of Rivendell tremble. The protection that has kept this valley safe since the elder days grows weak. I fear that even here, in the greatest refuge of the Noldor, we shall not find sanctuary from what comes." Elrond nodded slowly, his ageless features marked by an weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long. The time of the elves in Middle-earth draws to its end, my son. I have foreseen this day in dreams that came to me even before the sailing of the White Ship. But I had hoped, his voice faltered, I had hoped that our ending would come with peace, not with fire and terror. From the last homely house came the sound of many voices raised in song. But these were not the joyful melodies that had once echoed through these halls. These were the laments of a people preparing to make their final stand against an enemy that threatened not just their lives, but the very memory of all they had built and treasured. In the great library, scribes worked frantically to copy the most precious manuscripts, preparing them to be carried west to the Grey Havens before the darkness could devour all knowledge of the elder days. But even as they worked, the ink dried black as blood upon the pages, and the words themselves seemed to writhe and change, as if some malevolent force sought to corrupt even the written memory of beauty and wisdom. "The very language of the Eldar is under assault," said Lindir, chief of the scribes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Words of blessing become curses, songs of praise become lamentation. It is as if she who wakes seeks to unmake not just our bodies, but our very culture and heritage." Elrond turned from the darkening sky and entered his house, walking with purpose toward the chamber where the greatest treasures of Rivendell were kept. Here, in a casket wrought of mithril, and set with gems that caught and held the light of the two trees, lay Vilya, mightiest of the three rings of the elves. For long ages it had been his burden and his strength, the source of the power that kept Rivendell inviolate against the malice of the world. But now, as he looked upon it, he saw that the blue stone at its heart was dim, and hairline cracks spread across its surface like a spider's web. "Even the rings of power fail," he murmured, taking the ring upon his finger one last time. For a moment, the old strength flowed through him, and he saw clearly across all the leagues of Middle-earth, the armies gathering, the darkness spreading, and the Queen of the Deeps rising from her prison like a spider ascending her web. But he saw something else as well, something that gave him hope even in this darkest hour. In the Shire, small figures moved with purpose and courage. In Minas Tirith, King Elisar stood firm despite the magnitude of the threat. And in the deep places of the world, ancient powers that had slept since the music of creation began to stir, not in evil, but in response to the great need of the hour. "My sons!" he called, and Elladan and Elrohir came to him at once. "The time has come for the final gathering. Send word to every elf who still dwells in Middle-earth. Let them come to Rivendell with all speed. We shall make one last ride, as we did in the days of the last alliance. And though we may not return, we shall ensure that the darkness remembers the price of making war upon the children of Eru." But even as he spoke these words of defiance, Elrond knew in his heart that this battle would be unlike any that had come before. For the Queen of the Deeps was not merely another Dark Lord seeking dominion over Middle-earth. She was something far more ancient and terrible, a force of cosmic malevolence that sought not just to rule, but to unmake the very foundations of creation itself. Upon the Pelennor field, beneath the shadow of Minas Tirith, the greatest army that had assembled since the War of the Ring prepared for battle. But this was no orderly muster of disciplined troops. This was a desperate gathering of all who would stand against the darkness that threatened to devour the world. From Rohan had come King Eomer, no longer young but still mighty in war, leading the finest horsemen of the Mark. The sight of their banners snapping in the wind brought courage to many hearts. For the Rohirrim had never failed to answer Gondor's call in her hour of need. Yet even these proud riders spoke in hushed tones of horses that refused to cross certain streams and of shadows that moved against the wind. From the far north came Prince Bard of Dale, grandson of the bowman, leading a contingent of lakemen whose skill with bow and spear was renowned throughout the land. With them marched men of Esgaroth, grim-faced fishermen and traders who had seen their waters turn crimson with the bleeding of the earth itself. But strangest of all were those who came from the wild lands beyond the maps of mortal men, These were the descendants of those who had fled east and south in the elder day, bearing with them fragments of ancient lore and weapons forged in times when the world was young. Their leader was a woman tall and stern, clad in armor that seemed to shift and flow like water, bearing a spear whose point blazed with starlight. "I am Morwen of the Grey Marshes. Wanting Kirf Santi der Yomaterdin," she announced to King Elisar when she came before his banner. "My people have kept watch in the far places since the fall of Gondolin, waiting for the day when the ancient enemy would wake. That day has come, and we offer our spears to your service." Aragorn received her homage with grave courtesy, but in his heart he wondered if all their gathered strength would prove sufficient against the power that now stirred in the east. For the reports from his spies grew more dire with each passing hour. The very ground of Mordor had begun to crack and heave, as if something vast sought to claw its way up from the depths below. Gandalf the White stood beside the king's pavilion, his staff planted firmly in the earth of Gondor. But even his presence could not entirely dispel the shadow that seemed to hang over the assembled host. His face was grave, marked by a weariness that spoke of knowledge too terrible to share freely. "My lord," he said quietly to Aragorn, "I have walked many paths and seen many ages of the world, but never have I felt such dread as now oppresses my spirit. This enemy we face is not merely another servant of darkness. She is darkness itself, given form and will, the very flame imperishable that burns at the heart of creation trembles before her malice." From the north came urgent tidings that made the blood run cold in every warrior's vein. The Nazgul had broken through the defenses of the Shire, despite the valiant resistance of the hobbits. Bywater was in flames, and the Green Dragon Inn, that symbol of all that was peaceful and good in Middle-earth, had been cast down in ruin. Yet even in defeat, the Shire folk had won a victory of sorts. For Frodo Gardner, wielding Sting with a courage that would have made his namesake proud, had managed to wound one of the Nine Riders, driving it back with cries that echoed across the Barrow Downs. The blade that had once faced down Shelob in her tunnel had lost none of its power, and where it struck, the Nazgul's form had begun to unravel like smoke before the wind. "The little people fight bravely," said Éomer, reading the dispatches with grim satisfaction. "But they cannot hold long against such foes. We must march, and quickly, before all hope is lost." But Aragorn shook his head, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon, where storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed. To march now would be to march to our doom. See how the very sky turns against us? She who wakes has power over more than just the earth and stone. Wind and weather bend to her will, and she would strike us down ere we could close with her servants. As if summoned by his words, a great wind arose from the east, carrying with it the stench of corruption and decay. The banners of the assembled army snapped and tore in the gale, and many horses reared in terror at the malice that rode upon the air itself. In the howling of the wind, those with keen ears could hear laughter, not the clean mirth of mortal joy, but the terrible amusement of one who finds delight in the suffering of others. "She mocks us," growled Gimli, his knuckles white upon the haft of his axe. "Even now, she sits in her dark throne and laughs at our preparations, knowing that all our courage and skill will avail us nothing against her ancient power." But Legolas, whose eyes were keener than those of mortals, pointed toward the north, where a silver light had begun to glimmer through the storm clouds. "Look!" he cried, his voice ringing with sudden hope. "The elves come. Lord Elrond leads them, and with him rides the last host of Rivendell." Down the North Road they came, a sight to stir the heart and kindle courage, even in the darkest hour. At their head rode Elrond half-elven, bearing aloft a banner that blazed with the light of Gil-galad's star. Behind him came his sons, and all who remained of the Noldor in Middle-earth, their armor gleaming silver, and their voices raised in songs of battle that had not been heard since the last alliance. In the uttermost depths beneath the Black Gate, where the foundations of the world grew thin and the fires of creation still burned, the Queen of the Deeps completed the ritual that had taken her centuries to prepare. The crimson fluid that wept from every stone in Middle-earth flowed down through cracks in the earth, following paths older than the mountains themselves, until it pooled in the vast chamber where she held court. Here, where Morgoth himself had once delved in his fury and malice, she had built an altar from the heartstone of the world, that crystalline core, where the music of the Ainur had first taken physical form. Upon this altar, she had placed artifacts of terrible power, a shard of the Silmarils that Morgoth had clawed from Feanor's crown, a fragment of the two trees preserved in crystal, and most dreadful of all, the original mold from which the One Ring had been cast. The hour of remaking has come, she intoned, her voice resonating through dimensions that mortal minds could not comprehend. Too long has this flawed creation endured, marred by the discord of Melkor and the weakness of Ilúvatar's pity. I shall unmake it all and forge it anew in the fires of pure will, unconstrained by mercy or hope. She raised her hands, and the very foundations of Arda trembled at her command. From the Sea of Nirnan to the Bay of Belfalas, great cracks opened in the earth, swallowing forests and hills as if they were mere pebbles cast into a pond. The Anduin itself was swallowed in places, its waters disappearing into chasms that had no bottom. In Minas Tirith, the White Tower swayed like a reed in the wind, and cracks appeared in the walls that had stood inviolate for 3,000 years. King Elessar stood upon the highest parapet, his face set in grim resolve, as he watched his realm being torn asunder by forces beyond mortal comprehension. "My lord!" cried a messenger, his face pale with terror. "Osgiliath falls into the river. The bridge of stone that your ancestor built has crumbled, and the eastern bank slides into the waters like sand." But worse news was yet to come. From the Pelennor fields came reports that the very ground beneath the feet of the assembled army was beginning to crack and buckle. Great sinkholes opened without warning, swallowing horses and riders alike, while geysers of the crimson fluid erupted from the earth with such force that they stained the sky itself. "We cannot remain here," declared Éomer, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The earth itself rebels against us. We must move to higher ground or see our entire host swallowed by this madness." But Gandalf raised his staff, and for a moment the trembling ceased. His face was drawn with the effort of opposing such vast malice, but his voice remained steady. "Not higher ground, hallowed ground. There is one place in all of Gondor where her power cannot reach, where the very stones remember a blessing older than her malice. The Hallows," whispered Aragorn, understanding at once. "The tombs of my fathers, blessed by the Valar themselves, when Isildur first came to this land. But can we move so great a host before—" His words were cut off by a sound that made every heart quail with terror. From the east came a roaring as of some vast beast in pain and rage, but magnified beyond all natural measure. The sky itself seemed to crack like broken glass, and through the rents came pouring a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, the presence of something actively hostile to all creation. "She comes!" cried Legolas, his keen eyes piercing the supernatural gloom. "The Queen of the Deeps rises from her prison at last, and with her comes the host of the first darkness." Across the ruined landscape they came, not orcs or trolls or any creature that had walked in the light of sun or moon, but beings of pure shadow that had been old when the world was young. Some took the shapes of great spiders, their eyes burning like coals in the darkness. Others appeared as towering giants of living shadow, their forms shifting and changing with each step they took. But most terrible of all was she who led them, the Queen of the Deeps herself, revealed at last in all her terrible majesty. She was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, yet her beauty was that of a perfect storm or a flawless blade, created not to inspire love, but to bring destruction to all who beheld it. Her chariot was wrought from the bones of stars that had died before the making of Arda, drawn by steeds that were not horses, but concentrated darkness given form and will. In her hand, she bore a staff topped with a crystal that contained all the light that had ever been devoured by shadow, and its radiance was more terrible than the fires of Mount Doom. "Hear me, children of the marred music!" Her voice rang across the battlefield, beautiful and terrible as the song of creation itself. "Your age is ended, your hope is dust. Your courage is but the flickering of candles before the storm. I am the Queen of the Deep, the unmarred shadow, the first and last enemy. Kneel before me, and perhaps I shall grant you the mercy of swift annihilation." But from the host of the free peoples came no sound of surrender. Instead, King Elessar drew Anduril, and its blade blazed with light that had not dimmed since it was forged in the fires of the First Age. Beside him, Gandalf raised his staff, and its crystal blazed with the pure light of Valinor. And from 10,000 throats came the battle cry that had echoed across the fields of the Pelennor in the days of old. "Death, death, ride to ruin, and the world's ending." The battle that followed would be remembered, if any survived to remember it, as the War of the Last Music, for it was fought not merely with sword and spear, but with the very forces that had shaped the world at its beginning. Each clash of blade on blade sent shockwaves through the foundations of reality, and the dying screams of warriors echoed in dimensions beyond mortal understanding. King Elessar led the charge of the Dunedain, his banner streaming behind him as Anduril carved a path of blazing light through the ranks of shadow. Behind him rode Éomer and the Rohirrim, their spears bright as starlight, while overhead the great eagles of Manwë descended from their eyries to do battle with creatures of darkness that had wings like torn night. But for all their valor, it was clear that the forces of light were overmatched. Where one shadow being fell, 3 more rose to take its place, and the very air seemed thick with malice that sapped the strength from mortal limbs and clouded mortal minds with despair. Gandalf strode through the battle like a pillar of fire, his staff blazing with power that had not been seen in Middle-earth since the breaking of the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Where he passed, the creatures of shadow recoiled, but even his might was finite, and the Queen of the Deeps laughed to see him spend his strength against her endless host. "Mithrandir," she called mockingly across the battlefield, "still you cling to hope like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Do you not see that your very victory over Sauron was but a prelude to my awakening? Every ring destroyed, every shadow banished, every evil defeated, all served to weaken the barriers that held me bound." The terrible truth of her words struck Gandalf like a physical blow, for he saw at last the full scope of her design. The War of the Ring had not been won by the Free People. It had been orchestrated by the Queen of the Deeps herself, using Sauron as an unwitting tool to exhaust the Guardians of Middle-earth and clear the way for her own return. "You understand now?" she continued, her voice filled with malicious triumph. "Every noble sacrifice, every heroic deed, every victory of good over evil, all were but notes in the symphony of your doom." The halfling who carried the ring played his part perfectly, little knowing that every step toward Mount Doom brought him closer to breaking the final seal that held me bound. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm the hearts of the Free Peoples, a new sound was heard across the battlefield. The horn of Thorin Oakenshield, blown not in the Shire, but here on the field of final battle. From the north came Gimli and Legolas at the head of a host such as had not been seen since the last Alliance. Dwarves of all the 7 houses marching in perfect order, their axes gleaming and their voices raised in the ancient war songs of their people. "For Durin!" cried Gimli, his axe blazing with runes of power as he carved through the shadow host like wheat before the scythe. "For the mountain, for the memory of all who sleep in stone." Beside him, Legolas moved with the deadly grace of his people, his arrows finding their mark even in the supernatural darkness that shrouded the battlefield. Each shaft was wrought with spells of binding and banishment, forged in the halls of Thranduil by smiths who remembered the elder days. But the tide of battle truly turned when there came a sound that had not been heard since the breaking of Thangorodrim. The voice of Tom Bombadil raised in song. From the old forest he came, striding across the battlefield, as if the shadow beings were no more than morning mist. His voice rang clear and strong, singing words in a tongue older than any spoken language, words that spoke directly to the music of creation itself. "Ho there, old shadow," he called to the Queen of the Deeps, his bright eyes twinkling with a mirth that was older than malice. "You make a mighty noise for one who was bound beneath tree root and stone." But Tom remembers the first music. Yes, he does, and he knows that discordant notes must needs resolve to harmony in the end. The Queen of the Deeps recoiled, as if struck, for in Tom Bombadil she recognized something that her power could not touch, a being who existed in perfect harmony with the music of the Ainur, uncorrupted by desire for dominion or change. His very presence began to unravel the dark symphony she had woven, causing her shadow host to flicker and fade like smoke before the wind. "Impossible!" she shrieked, her perfect features twisted with rage and fear. "You are nothing, a remnant of the first days, powerless and forgotten." But Tom only laughed, bright and merry as water over stone. "Forgotten? Old Tom is never forgotten by those who matter. And powerless?" He gestured with one weathered hand, and the crimson fluid that had wept from every stone in Middle-earth suddenly reversed its flow, rushing back toward its source like a tide returning to the sea. Tom remembers when the world was made, and he knows the secret of unmaking what should never have been wrought. In that moment of revelation, as Tom Bombadil's ancient song began to unweave the dark magic that had torn the very foundations of the world, the true nature of the conflict became clear to all who fought upon that field of final battle. This was not merely a war between good and evil, but a struggle for the very essence of creation itself. The Queen of the Deeps, sensing her power waning as her crimson lifeblood flowed back to its source, raised her staff of captured starlight and spoke words in the true black speech. Not the crude tongue that Sauron had taught his servants, but the original language of discord that Morgoth had used to mar the music of creation. The air itself seemed to crack and bleed at the sound, and reality bent like heated metal under the force of her will. "If I cannot remake this flawed world," she declared, her voice now terrible beyond all description, "then I shall see it all reduced to the void from which it came. Let the music end in silence, and let darkness reign eternal." She struck her staff upon the ground, and the very earth split apart like a broken eggshell. From the cracks came pouring forth the primordial chaos that had existed before the Ainur first sang the world into being, a nothingness so absolute that it devoured not just matter and energy, but the very concepts of existence itself. Where it touched, warriors simply ceased to be, not killed or destroyed, but erased so completely that even memory of them faded from the minds of their companions. Entire sections of the battlefield vanished into unbeing, leaving gaps in reality that hurt the eyes and minds of those who looked upon them. But Tom Bombadil stood unmoved in the face of this ultimate destruction, his song growing stronger and more joyful with each passing moment. Around him, the free peoples gathered, not in formation for battle, but in a great circle, as if they were children gathering around a beloved grandfather to hear an old tale. "Join your voices to mine," he called to them, his eyes bright with the wisdom of ages. "Sing the song that was sung at the beginning, the music that called light from darkness and order from chaos. For though she may unmake the world, she cannot unmake the song itself. That is beyond her power, as it was beyond the power of Morgoth himself." And so they sang, men and elves, dwarves and hobbits, all the free peoples of Middle-earth, lifting their voices in a harmony that had not been heard since the Ainur first sang before the throne of Iluvatar. King Elisar's voice rang clear and strong, carrying the memory of all the kings of Gondor who had come before him. Éomer sang with the wild freedom of the mark, while Gimli's bass tones carried the strength of mountains and the patience of stone. Even Gandalf joined his voice to theirs, and as he sang, his form began to change. The gray robes fell away like shed skin, revealing not the white wizard they had known, but something far more ancient and terrible its beauty. Oloran the Maya, as he had been before he took physical form to walk among the children of Iluvatar. The Queen of the Deeps screamed in rage and fear as she felt her power being turned against her, for the song that the Free Peoples sang was not merely music, it was the original music of creation itself, and it reminded the world of what it was meant to be. The crimson fluid that was her lifeblood flowed faster and faster back to its source, carrying with it all the malice and corruption she had spread across Middle-earth. "You cannot!" she cried, her perfect features dissolving as her very essence began to unravel. "I am eternal. I am the shadow that existed before the light, the silence that came before the song." But Tom Bombadil only smiled, his weathered face kind and patient as ever. "Old shadow, don't you see? There never was a silence before the song, for Iluvatar thought the music before he sang it, and his thoughts are eternal. You were never first, never eternal. You were only discord in the harmony, and discord must always resolve in the end." With a final shriek that shattered the last of her shadow host and sent cracks running through the very fabric of reality, the Queen of the Deeps collapsed in upon herself. Her stolen starlight fled back to the heavens where it belonged, her crystal throne crumbled to dust, and her form dissolved into nothingness. Not the productive void from which creation springs, but the empty negation that has no substance or meaning. As her malice faded from the world, the great cracks in the earth began to heal themselves. The Anduin resumed its ancient course, the mountains stood firm once more, and across all the lands of Middle-earth, the stones wept tears of joy instead of blood. Epilogue: The New Dawn. In the days that followed the War of the Last Music, the Free Peoples worked together to heal the wounds that had been torn in the world. The Shire was rebuilt, greener and more beautiful than ever, and the party field at Hobbiton once again echoed with laughter and song. The Prancing Pony reopened its doors, and Barlaman Butterbur's descendant served ale to travelers who brought tales of wonder from the far corners of Middle-earth. King Elisar ruled long and well from the restored throne of Gondor, and his reign was remembered as the beginning of a new age of peace and prosperity. The friendship between the Free People, forged in the fires of ultimate peril, endured long after the last of those who had sung the last music had passed into legend. But perhaps the greatest wonder of all was that Tom Bombadil remained in his house by the Withywindle, as merry and enigmatic as ever. When asked by those who sought his wisdom about the nature of the victory they had won, he would only smile and say, "Old Tom knows a secret. Yes, he does. The music never ends. It only changes key from time to time. And as long as there are those who remember the original song, the world will always find its way back to harmony in the end. And in the deep places of the earth, where once crimson tears had wept from living stone, new springs bubbled up pure and clear, carrying with them the memory of the song that had saved the world and the promise that it would never be wholly silent again." Thus ended the Age of Shadows and began the Age of the Renewed Song, when all the children of Iluvatar learned once more to hear the music that underlies all things and to add their own voices to its eternal harmony. Here ends the tale of Blood over the Black Gate, as it was sung by the minstrels in the halls of King, and written in the Red Book of Westmarch, and remembered by all who love the light more than the darkness.